Welcome back to Real Talk with Brian and Dan on 1150 AM KKNW. I'm Brian.
And I'm Dan.
Our next guest is Mears of Kengo Kuma and Associates. Aya graduated from Cornell University in 2018 with a Bachelor of Architecture. After graduating, Aya was a junior faculty member in the Department of Architecture at her school for the first-year design studio and is most recently working at Kengo Kuma's office in Tokyo, Japan, most notably architect of the 2020 Olympic Stadium. Aya, what do you do when you're not being an architect?
I'm a relatively tame person, actually. I enjoy reading. Cooking is a good creative outlet for me. In the wintertime, skiing. I occasionally go bouldering. But I am kind of a nerd, so I enjoy going to museums for the art and the architecture and researching architecture in my spare time.
What do you like to cook?
Ooh, I mean, I picked up cooking when we did our semester in Rome, so Italian cooking is fun.
Nice.
Enjoy Japanese food, thanks to my mom, and anything new, really. It's just a chance to explore. That way.
Well, and we like to ask our guests something fond about the home they grew up in. So you grew up here in the Northwest, right?
I did. I actually have never moved to a different house. And then when I went to college, I was living somewhere different every year or every semester, which was kind of a big change from that. I don't have one specific memory necessarily, but home has always been a very steady and consistent place for me. It was a place to study and explore my interests, and I guess we like to talk about safe spaces a lot, so home has always been that.
Safe space for you, yeah.
Nice. Are there any new trends within the architectural discipline?
There are many trends within the architecture discipline. The industry is always evolving, but I guess related to real estate a little bit, there's been a trend in the last 10 years or so of more architect developers coming up. This job provides end-to-end control of the process. So architecture and developers are traditionally very separate things. Obviously, architects really focus on just the design aspect of it. Whereas the developer will work more with contractors and I guess do more of the business negotiations. So with the rise of technology and BIM or building information modeling software, it becomes important for the architect to try to branch out and have more control over the processes that way.
It's interesting because I know as Brian and I look at, kind of what's being built out there, new construction, I probably say maybe 3 or 4 years ago, you started to see traditional just builders start to incorporate more design versus just straight up building. And I'll mention names like Quadrant and D.R. Horton, where they were pretty, I wouldn't say totally utilitarian, but they started to adopt some of the things that some of the more, I would say, architectural style, where you actually put, craftsman style finishes out there rather than just building a home for a home. And I would say that probably started maybe 10 years ago. Feels like it. Feels like it.
And I would assume some of the finishes are architectural choices, not just design. But like I'm seeing a trend using some stone on the front of some of these homes that looks like cinder block. It's not, but it's like, dang.
So what do you think are the benefits of being an architect/developer?
So besides obvious aesthetic benefits, because of how the architect is trained, the site can often be optimized for sustainability and efficiently go into planning their future developments instead of actually putting up new constructions. So architects are knowledgeable about things like building code, the history of design, as well as contemporary and projecting future trends. So I think it's a win-win all the way around.
So you're talking about architect developer. That's kind of a new phrase to me. That's meaning actually doing the design and the build. Is that right?
So there are actual design build companies, but I suppose you can think of an architect developer being in kind of the same vein as that.
Because historically, isn't that how this all evolved? I mean, I think.
Well, when you mention like Quadrant homes and kind of those big developments that are going up, those constitute about 80% of, I guess, the at least residential properties that are built. And those 80% that are done by developers actually don't involve an architect at all.
Right.
They're very just kind of cookie cutter model homes that don't really need much
Well,
thought
once
go
they get a
behind them.
design for 5 different types, that's
Right.
it. They're
Yeah.
putting
Please.
those 5 and
And
you're
they'll
saying-
reverse them.
Yeah,
There's 10.
and maybe a different elevation here.
Right.
But it's more, I would say, more of the craft-built homes. John Buchan, even though they're a little cookie cutter, Murray Franklin, I know they have an architect on staff, but it's just one, right? And they're building a lot of homes, and they're probably not going to change styles because the buyers like that. So it sounds to me like an architect's role is more in the commercial space, more in the custom home space, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, as an emerging architect, what's something you're passionate about?
In the last couple of years of school, I discovered I really like the kind of experiential or phenomenological side of architecture.
Wait, say that again.
Phenomenological.
Phenomenological?
Basically, it's really putting yourself in a first-person perspective of designing. So when you enter a space, when you approach it, what's kind of the atmosphere, the vibe that you want within the space, rather than just having the exterior view, that bird's eye view, and plan the kind of like general ways that architecture is conceived of. So it's a more intimate way of approaching.
It must be interesting with stuff like Oculus 3D. You can kind of immerse yourself in a design. Did you get an opportunity to look at some of that or study some of that stuff?
Right as I was graduating, actually, there were a couple studios that were venturing into doing VR studios and getting into that realm. The school likes to brag about how the first rendering software was developed by a professor in the CS department, actually. So they've started to kind of cross over between the two departments, but I had already decided that I kind of wanted to focus on something else, so I did not dabble into the VR studios.
The more
but-
tactile stuff, yeah.
yeah.
But you were saying, and I sort of jumped a little bit, but more of the immersive kind of design style?
Yeah. So that whole like experiential facet of it is something that should be taken into consideration regardless of any project that you do, right? You try to do the best job that you can with any kind of
Right.
space. But for me, it manifests mostly when I work on hospitality geared projects. So restaurants, hotels,
Mhm.
that kind of thing, where the user experience is really a key part of the client's business and for them to be able to sell whatever their product might be. So, yeah.
Well, so you mentioned sustainability before in contemporary architecture, and I think for me it actually, you can kind of walk in. A good example would be, what is the geodesic thing, the Amazon sphere that they have down there? You just have a feeling when you walk into something that's been designed with an environment in mind, right?
Yep.
So how is that playing into what it is you're looking to do?
The idea of sustainability?
Yes.
Well, everyone has their own opinion about what sustainability is. It's a very trendy buzzword, has been for quite some time now. Generally, in the US at least, the average life expectancy of a new construction is 30 to 40 years, which is not a very long time when you think about the history of some of the real cultural icons that can be found around the world. But that has to do a lot with, again, the economy. If you decide to keep up buildings for a longer period of time, then architects don't really have jobs for new construction. They turn more towards restoration and renovation instead. And the last place I was working was Tokyo at Kuma's office. Tokyo is similar in that way. They generally stick to about 30 years before they tear down and reconstruct a building in its place. This does have to do, on the one hand, with building technology, which is changing. Obviously, a place like Japan has some of the best earthquake structure technology that we've ever seen, out of necessity more than anything else.
Yeah.
But also the actual technology that's embedded within the walls, ways of optimizing how the building runs, that kind of thing, mechanical systems, etc. So even as there are cities within the U.S. and worldwide that are pushing for densification of their urban areas just because it is a more sustainable way just to have people closer together, you're not traveling, expending as much energy that way, that does mean that buildings are going to be demolished as they're put up in those places because you want to stay kind of confined within this footprint instead. But again, sustainability for the business side of architects is not always great. Actually, the office in Japan has a large population of Italians working there because Italy has the highest per capita of architects. It's
Really?
something like
Interesting.
1 in 45 people.
Kind of like real estate brokers here.
Yeah, about 1 in 45 people in Italy are trained architects, which is terrible for a country that prides itself on its history, does not like to
Right.
put up new constructions.
Well, they're like, look, we built that. It's still standing. We're done. Right.
Exactly. So everyone there ends up working in restoration or renovation instead.
Yeah.
So,
Interesting.
so you said you studied in Italy also.
First semester, yeah.
Okay. So you were over there at Florence?
Rome.
Rome. Okay.
Rome, nice.
All right. And that was part of your architecture school at Cornell, or
Yes, it was a mandatory.
mandatory?
Brutal.
But that's where you
I know,
learn to
terrible.
cook, right? Italian
Yeah.
food
Yeah,
and all
there
that.
you go.
So do you think the design is approached differently in Japan than the U.S.?
It's hard to say since I was only in Japan, in Tokyo, for a couple months. There is definitely a huge influence of international style and modernist movements, particularly in post-war architecture in Japan. But even so, this integration and influence of Western design is still mediated by this really strong foundation of Japanese architecture embedded within their cultural history, their religious history, etc. At Kengo Kuma's office, actually, the roof form of the building was really emphasized there, which I think is often overlooked in this kind of strictly modern movement, which has kind of filtered its way through the U.S. as well. It started in Europe and then filtered over here. But there we worked a lot on kind of the roof form, this idea of a floating object over the landscape, and that's really kind of the highlighting iconic moment in all of his projects. So it was nice to have a perspective where, hey, we don't really, it's not that we don't care about this, but this is the most important thing. You know, this is what we want attached with the firm's name and to be associated with it.
So, what is the most valuable lesson you've learned thus far?
At my first internship, my boss really emphasized the importance of looking about 10 years ahead, anticipating trends not only within the architectural profession, but in how the needs of society will change along with how humans interact with those spaces. Cultural institutions such as libraries are not obsolete yet, but they can no longer be conceived of and constructed in the same way as they were, 10, 20, 50 years ago. They have to reflect the changing needs of society and how research is conducted and how information is consumed.
Don't need bookshelves.
Data centers.
Yeah.
There's actually, I don't remember where this library went up, built within the last couple of years or so. Actually came under fire because they had books on the shelves for these like beautiful, beautiful tall shelves, like tens of feet high, and above maybe like 15 feet or so was just wallpaper. They didn't actually have books on the shelves, so it was a total farce in that sense. So if that's the trend for libraries, then I don't know if I can get behind that one. But,
Right.
to each their own.
Yeah.
And I think another really good example is actually e-commerce. The traditional brick and mortar stores are dying, and they aren't able to keep people coming into their shops because, especially like in this area, we love talking about Amazon and how it's dominated the retail industry. So in that we don't really need brick and mortar stores any more than we have to start looking towards warehouses, for better or for worse. So we go from these really warm, inviting atmospheres to how can we make industrial chic like as inviting and as nice of a space for the workers that are there as we can.
Yeah.
Aya, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank
That
you for
was,
having me.
Very interesting. Remember, all of the segments of our show are available to watch on our YouTube channel. If you're interested in learning more about any of our guests, please subscribe. Join us after the break for some final thoughts and something fun to do.